This is the Patchwork Suite, where a single musical theme is the common thread in a season of variations. The heart of these variations is the theme we're listening to now, a poetic waltz by Enrique Granados. I'm your Patchwork Suite host, Mary Claire Murphy, and throughout the series, I speak with composers who have graciously written a short work expressly for this podcast. I've asked each composer to draw on both the Granados theme and on a textile they find meaningful. With each new voice we hear, and with each musical sampling, we're building a colorful and diverse patchwork of artistic expression. To the patchwork, we add a classic crochet project, the Granny Square. It's small but mighty with a splash of color, still intricate though, like a yarn version of lace. The fiber arts aspect of this podcast prompted pianist and composer Stephen Naylor to not just research the basics of crochet technique, but to go the extra mile and try it for himself before he wrote his variation on the Granados waltz theme.
Whenever I go into a new piece, I kind of like to treat it like I'm method acting. I like to try and just dig into the research phase as much as I can. So with this piece, I knew that I would have to learn how to crochet a little bit so that I could actually write a piece that was representative of the experience, which was my goal.
For a crocheting demonstration, Stephen had no further to look than his own partner, Christiana, and she was happy to oblige.
I asked Christiana, hey babe, can you teach me some basics here? And she was like, absolutely. And so I learned the very beginning elements of crocheting, which is like the Slipknot, which is like the very beginning strand that you're going to work with, and then how you do some basic stitches, and then how you finish a project, which is called binding off.
Learning these aspects of crocheting gave Stephen the perfect 3-part framework for his Patchwork Suite variation. We'll listen to each section in detail, of course, but first, let's understand a little more about Stephen as a Michigan-raised musical mastermind.
There was a little bit of music in the house. My dad taught guitar lessons and repaired guitars as well. And so the first musical sounds that I heard as a kid, I was very little. I was as an infant in his studio, hearing him fixing guitars and playing and teaching lessons and stuff. And then my mother at one point in junior high had played flute, and as it turned out, when it came time for me to go into junior high and go to band, it was her old flute that I picked up as my instrument there. And so I have connections from both of my parents and in music in some regard.
Those connections established a creative foundation in Stephen's life, as did his love for the scenic Michigan landscape.
I find a lot of inspiration, but also just solace, whether it's the forests in Michigan that I grew up exploring, or big bodies of water. Again, it's the Great Lakes. Can you tell I'm a Michigander and I'm proud of it? Being in those spaces as a child really set me up for what I find peace in now. There's this great poet, Wendell Berry, and he has his poem, The Peace of Wild Things, which is all about having natural spaces where you really can be at peace and figure yourself out, and I think that's a big part of who I am.
Following his childhood years in Saginaw, Michigan, Stephen went on to study piano performance and composition at Bowling Green State University. And now these days, he's a resident artist with the Toledo Opera.
I tell everybody I'm spoiled with the level of singers that I get to work with there on a daily basis. There are 4 other resident artists like me. We're all young artists, beginning of our burgeoning careers. And there are also professional singers that come through that I get to work with. But so one of the programs that we do there is Opera on Wheels, where we go into elementary schools and present a children's version of an opera And we have mobile sets and electric keyboard that we pack up and take everywhere. And we introduce them to what opera is like, which is really fun.
Despite his busy schedule, Stephen still finds time to compose, which brings us back to the work he wrote for today. It's a 3-section piano miniature that's structured like a crochet project, so he titled it Slipknot, Stitches, and Bind Off. Each section mimics the physical gestures of crocheting.
One of my ideas for the very beginning of the process of writing it was I wanted to actually mimic the fingers that are used in certain ways and the positions of the hand as well. So at the very beginning of the piece, something that I have written, which I don't normally write into my music, but I have fingerings. I want you to use these specific fingers on certain gestures, like these dyads at the beginning. The way that the left hand creeps in between those two dyads and starts its own little syncopated gesture is me trying to replicate at the keyboard what it feels like to actually be making the Slipknot at the beginning.
Then in the middle section, we find the right and left hand parts constantly intertwining to represent the stitching of, say, a granny square.
As I was actually recording it just now, I really was feeling how much the two hands are interweaving with each other throughout. There's a lot of hand crossing, and my hands are playing on top of each other a lot. I think I can credit Maurice Ravel to that, actually, and all of his stuff that I've played, he does that all of the time. And so I'm trying to make this interweaving kind of texture between the hands and fingers.
There's another very narrative element of Slipknot, Stitches, and Bind Off, but it remains an optional component of the score. For those who dare, Stephen's thrown down the gauntlet.
A salient part of this piece for me was going to be that I would use an actual crochet hook on the strings of the keyboard and hit it almost like a hammered dulcimer. And as I kept practicing the piece and composing the piece, I wanted that to stay as an optional element. And so if there's anybody who is brave enough to work on those extended techniques, please feel free. I want to hear what that sounds like.
Whether or not you'd like to attempt the piece with a crochet hook, all hands are back on the keyboard for the final 2 measures, the bind off. At this point, the music invites us to stand back and admire the final product in its entirety.
The conclusion of the piece has a couple of funny little moments. There's a little glissando that sort of marks the end of the stitches section. But then the final phrase of the piece, I wanted to get a sense of finality. And after having so many notes playing during the piece, I thought, what if I could cram all 12 notes of the chromatic scale into a measure of 3/4, and so there's 12 16th notes there for you. Can I make it work? And also, can I incorporate the ending melodic fragment from the Granados theme? And that just took some playgrounding around and figuring out what would work and kind of form a progression of voice leading and everything. But that is there. So the last thing that you'll hear in the piece is the same as the ending of Granados' original theme, wildly reharmonized.
It was with great success that Stephen nestled the waltz fragment into a complete chromatic collection. It's a bit camouflaged, but if we sharpen our senses a bit, I think we can spot it together. To know what we're looking for, let's get a refresher on the end of the Poetic Waltz theme. In the key of A major, The melody skipped upwards at the cadence and then stepped back down. Stephen incorporated that same idea in the bind-off, but in the key of A-flat major instead. And then he cast that fragment into a chromatic collection, almost like scattering seeds among wildflowers. Now you might be wondering if you can find other Granados Easter eggs throughout the piece, but the first two sections draw less on the waltz melody than they do on its harmonic possibilities.
I love harmony. I think about it almost before I think about any other musical element. It's the thing that I have the most fun exploring with. And so I took Granados' theme, and for every measure of his piece, I just grouped all of the pitches that were in there together. And so the first measure, there's like A, B, C sharp, D in the right hand, and A, E, C sharp. And so that combines into like the first 5 pitches of the major scale, right? So the first several measures of my stitches section just use the first 5 pitches of a different major scale. It's A flat major in this case, but that harmonic material is still there. And so I go on, measure 2 contains these certain pitches, which form like the next cluster of notes, and then measure 3 has a certain set of pitches, and those form the next cluster of notes.
You'll notice Stephen's variation doesn't rely heavily on block chords for harmony. Instead, we find more subtle, luxurious harmonies that build one pitch at a time with the help of the piano sustain pedal. Stephen took all that harmonic content from the Granados waltz and then rhythmically liberated it.
When I took this harmonic material from Granados, I didn't keep it in the same metrical aspect. That was one of the things that I wanted to stay intuitive, so that not everything was structured out in advance. I always need at least 1 or 2 things that are like the actual decisions that I have to make in the moment of composition.
Let's now live in the moment with Stephen, enjoying wherever the whimsy may carry us as he performs his patchwork suite variation, Slipknot, Stitches, and Bind Off. Pianist and composer Stephen Naylor mimicked crochet technique with that piano miniature, titled Slipknot, Stitches, and Bind Off. It was another unique take on a poetic waltz by Enrique Granados. And for those who wish to further the connection between the musical and fiber arts in this composition, the score is equipped with an extended technique using an actual crochet hook to strike the right hand part. But for today, we heard Stephen's original recording. Special thanks to Stephen for his contribution and conversation on the Patchwork Suite. To learn more about the podcast or to revisit the original Granados theme, cue up the Patchwork Suite Episode 1 and find all subsequent episodes online at wgte.org.